Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact and donate. And don't forget, if you're enjoying this podcast, go to Apple Podcasts and leave a rating and review, and then share it with your friends and network. Previous guests on the show have included Alan Hirsch, Pam Arland, and Shayla Visser. You could go back and listen to those episodes and more. But today's guest is JR Woodward. JR co-founded the Missio Alliance and currently serves as the national director for the V3 church planting movement. He has been passionately planting churches on the East and West Coast that value tight-knit community, life-forming discipleship, locally rooted presence, and boundary-crossing mission for over 30 years. We have a fantastic conversation around coaching, the spaces of belonging, and how the powers and principalities affect us, our leadership, and our imitation of Christ. Enjoy the episode. This episode is brought to you by All Nations Kansas City. All Nations trains and sends disciple makers all over the world to make disciples that make disciples among neglected people. If you want to see the kingdom come, if you want to see Jesus embodied, if you want to see a movement of disciples making disciples, check out All Nations at allnations.us. Join us on the leading edge. This podcast is done in association with the MX Platform and 100M Publishing. Do you want to be resourced and equipped to release movement in your context? Well, then connect with movement leaders and practitioners for coaching, resources, and training at the mxplatform.com. JR, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, glad to be here, man.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your story as you transitioned into to starting V3, and what does that look like? Why did you say, hey, this is where we need to go, what we need to do? What was that process like for you?
Yeah. Well, I came to faith in college right before my senior year. 4 years later, planted my first church at Blacksburg, Virginia, at Virginia Tech, and then went to LA and planted 3 churches there. And so actually, I thought I was going to go thinking about planting a church in San Francisco. And I went up there, had multiple conversations, just wasn't quite sure yet. And then I said, okay, I'm going to take 2 weeks and just try to talk to as many people as possible. So Linda Berquist is a connection that Alan Hirsch gave me up there. And, she introduced me. She knows everybody in San Francisco. So I probably met with like a dozen planters, someone who planted 20 years to 2 months, and from the largest to the smallest church, and just tried to get a sense of what was happening there. And, was God called me to be there. And I got a sense at that time, and that was back in 2012, 2013, where it just felt like there was a lot of planters there, and there were a lot of more churches that were getting roots there, which was not the case before that. And I just about felt like, man, I wonder if it'd be better for me to help these churches instead of plant something. Not that I do think there's a unique angle that I take on planting, but at the same time, I just felt, that feeling. So then my last guy I talked to, Tom Brown, I think. He was a guy who met with Dallas Willard after he wrote the Spirit of the Disciplines back in, the 70s or 80s.
Yeah.
And so he was just thinking Dallas was saying, I know this works for me, but see if it works for your community. So this guy was into spiritual formation super early. And I could tell because this guy had a presence about him, and he was very present to me. And so this was my last interview of the time, and he just kind of asked me questions for a straight hour. And then he just reflected back, I noticed when you said this, that your face really lit up. And, when you talked about this and wow. Then he shared a story, and this is kind of the story that was pivotal for me and kind of got me into doing what I'm doing right now. Having been a planter in 25 years, I really only imagined myself planting for the rest of my life in that sense. And but he goes, apparently St. Francis was trying to discern what he was going to do with his future, whether he was going to be a itinerant preacher or just stay in one place. And the way he discerned this was he went to his trusted friends and asked them to discern on his behalf. And so they went and they prayed, came back and said, we think you should be an itinerant preacher. He says, thanks be to God. And that's what he did. And so that story kind of stuck with me. And in a way, like I'm always about making communal decisions. I kind of rarely do an individual decision, but this was another level because I felt like God was saying, well, I want you to go to your trusted friends and let them decide what your next thing is going to be. And that's another level of thing. I wrestled with God on that a little bit, but then I thought, okay, well, who would I have do this? I thought about 7 people and at least kind of one, person like David Fitch, who tends to, go against the flow. I figured if they're all come up to the same decision, I can take it as from the Lord. and so I gave them some options. I can stay in LA and continue to plant, go to San Francisco and plant. I could train church planters, or maybe they have a fourth option that I'm not aware of. After some prayer, meeting together, dialoguing, they all kind of came to the same conclusion: I should help church planters. And it was a lot more to the story, but it was about a month later, I got a call from the Virginia Baptists, who I did some work with before, kind of consulting work. They wanted me to apply for essentially what their church planting arm, which is called V3. And I kind of resisted for a while because Baptists did not have a great missional, reputation. In fact, I had read someone did their master's degree and said that 40% of the people, if you tell them you're a Baptist church, they don't want to join. And I was telling John Upton, who's a director of Virginia Baptist, says, "Oh, it's only 40%." Anyway, because today nobody, if you're Baptist church, you don't put Baptist in your name anymore. So long story short, I made an application. I was still trying to discern, and it took me about a month to discern. But once I did, I called them and said, "Hey, if that job's available, I'll take it." And they didn't really offer it to me until I felt called to it, which I thought was a really cool thing. Yeah. So that's kind of was the beginning of V3, how I got there. As I kind of started to, think about things, one of the things I had been thinking for a long time is that we need to move away from this kind of church planting boot camp of 7 days or 5 days and move to a much longer, elongated training where people are on the ground, where they get a coach or two, where we kind of go through more of a week by week thing, maybe 8 months long journey, as opposed to, that 5 things. So that was what started. And we, that first year, after kind of assessing the situation there, I realized every movement there's an acronym that people use, CARTS, coaching, assessment, coaching, recruiting, assessment, coaching, assessment, recruiting, training, and support. And the most critical I thought to start with was the coaching and obviously assessment along the way, recruiting you have to do, but the training and coaching together, to me, would be a good way to start kind of some movement. So that's how it began.
Wow. And it seems like, coaching really got you to that place as well. Just an hour coaching session that you didn't know was going to be a coaching session, right?
Right. And, absolutely. Yeah.
And, that's the power of coaching, isn't it? Is to walk with people to really to reflect what is going on in somebody and be present with somebody. And it takes an art. What have you seen as the power of coaching as you're training church planters, as they're going out? What is that power of coaching that you've seen?
Yeah, I think number one, one of the things that we require of all of our coaches is that they've actually done the things that they're going to be coaching others to do. Yeah. That's pretty critical. And sometimes, you got good people that you'd want to bring in, but they haven't quite really done what our training is. And so as good of a person as they are, we've had to refuse them being a part. Because I ultimately think when it comes to, planting, that people we learn a lot by imitation, and we learn a lot about what other people are doing and have done more than instruction. So imitation and immersion, to me, immersion and mission are the key elements of discipleship. Now, coaching I look at a bit different because we do most of our training online because we're kind of connecting with the planters while they're in their local area. So they have to have a small team in their area to become a part of the training. And I think the coaches, we have material that they go through. First year we used the Church's Movement book that Dan and I wrote, and but you always have to contextualize, the content, and so and you have to wrestle through, how it might fit in your particular context. And so, coaching really does that. They if you're coaching from experience, you can really tell that as well. So I think those are key elements, obviously good listening and so forth, but there's different types of coaching. And as you probably know, because we're like, I think we look at like church planting is like, if you're going to climb the Himalayas, you want somebody who's done that before. Yeah, and there are some very concrete skills that you got to know if you want to survive.
Yeah.
And these are like non-negotiables. It's not just like a nice idea.
Yeah, so, one of our missionaries just almost died last week on the Himalayas. He was up in northern India trying to just climb a mountain, just go on a hike, and he almost died. So it's important that you know what you're doing.
Yeah, so we kind of talk about like Sherpas and like the need in them, and that we're equipping you in the core things that you need to know when it comes to planting a church. And so we take a equipping approach to coaching. Which is kind of, again, there's like life coaching, there's other types of coaching. Right. All of it is important and well, but this is trying to pass on particular competencies that they can kind of enact in their local place. And part of that requires a learning process that's quite different than what most of us kind of grew up in, which is kind of, usually, what's in our mind going to someone else's mind. So we have like three processes to our learning formation, which is a meta learning. What's the big idea that God's speaking to you? Reflective learning, where you're asking questions and going deeper, but you really haven't learned until you've done experiential learning. What are you going to do this week as a result of what you learned? And then we start the next call with looking at, did they do that? What did they experience? How was it? And so every week, and the reason why, week to week over a long period of time is because they really haven't learned until they've done something with the knowledge.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That experience, that immersion is key, and as I've been coaching church planters, as I've found that coaching itself and that reflective learning and then putting it into practice that week as they're in the situation has created a situation where we've seen a lot more fruit in our ministry because we've actually implemented a weekly coaching. As they're doing it, they're reflecting back, this worked, this didn't work, where am I headed? And they have a foundation of learning, right? So they've learned, they have the fundamentals, and they're able to start to implement. And so what does that look like? What's the big process for you to be able to get people into those meta ideas, those big ideas, and then that experiential learning, and then the reflective with the coach? What does that process look like for planters?
Yeah. Well, so like I said, we tend to there's a very little bit of reading, and we have about 8 competencies that we work through, and there's probably like 3 to 4 subdivisions in each of those competencies. And so you're just really taking a very small idea reading. They kind of reflect on what they're getting from that. We go through, or they share their big idea. We have some reflection questions that they're already thought about and wrote up. So by the time we get to the discussion, they're already kind of, have thought about it. And so they've had to read and put up their stuff before we meet on our call. I think that's pretty important to make sure that they're engaging the material. We engage it with them reflectively, and then they share what they're wanting to do this week. And then we start the next week, like I said, with looking, what was your experience? What did you do? How did it go? And, we usually for the first year, we use 2 coaches. So you kind of have different perspectives. You have about 6 to 8 planters, and obviously not everybody can talk on everything. And so you kind of key in on a few, you hone in deeply, and with the idea that we can all learn from this person as well and what they're doing. But that's essentially the flow of the coaching call.
Yeah, as you've seen them start to implement what they have learned, how do you assess a healthy church? What does church health look like, and how do we know that we are, I mean, looking like Jesus in the middle of
Sure.
church?
Well, so like I think this is kind of where one of the ways is like their understanding of the four spaces of belonging. So really key to our training is I feel like right now the tail is wagging the dog in the sense that public space is kind of most people's primary space in the North America. And what we do in our training is make personal space within social space the primary. So intimate space being those 3 to 4 people.
Yeah.
So personal space being that 5 to 12, social space being the 20 to 50, 70 or more being public space. Today, maybe 90% of people's energy goes to public spaces.
Right.
We hope to get people before they start a public space so they don't do it for another year or two.
Yeah.
And our goal, really, the first year is very simple. Like our learning output is to start a discipleship core of about 5 to 12 people.
Yeah.
And together they are building a social space. So that discipleship core is a bounded set by invite only, so that they can actually grow deep. And the social space is oriented around mission, where we hope that there's like at least 50% of the people that are non-Christians. And that's what they're learning and training to build together. And the goal is at the end of the year, they've just done that. They've started they've gone through a discipleship pathway of 8 months, and they've grown their social space to 20 to 50 people, and now they're ready to multiply. So a healthy church, we basically move discipleship from the peripheral of what the church does, and we don't think discipleship is what you get from the pulpit. We like to say that, not only do we imitate Jesus, the disciple, but we imitate Jesus, the disciple maker. And he clearly was oriented around his 90% was on those 12. Yeah. And he brought them in those other spaces with him. But this was his core space that he knew he was leaving it with these people to turn the world upside down.
Yeah.
And so healthy church means like you actually have people that looking more like Jesus.
Yeah.
That takes discipleship. That takes going into our lives deeply. And there's that like as opposed to one-on-one, which obviously you have some of that too, but I think there's a social element to that personal space that brings dynamics out that one-on-one never does. And so, what makes it dynamic too is that they're building this social space, which is dedicated to mission. It's not just another place for community to get together. That's where we're doing mission based on your neighborhood or network, the oikos that you're kind of trying to connect with. So that's kind of the core of what we're building. So health to me is like people are growing in the character and competencies of Jesus. They're looking more like him, which means that they know how to live on mission well and love others. They know how to be a community together with each other. I think instead of asking how many people come to our service, we need to ask how many people look more like Jesus, how many people are displaying the fruit of the Spirit. Yeah. If you have that, you have a healthy church. If you don't have that, it doesn't matter what your size is, it's not healthy.
Oh, well, for you, those 4 spaces of belonging, what's the dynamics and the interchange between those? I just found that in a lot of our movements that we're trying, as for me, as somebody who leads a missions agency that wants to see church planting movements around the world, and we have church planters, for me, it seems like that social space is a missing piece. It's a missing element. And I don't know how to get there. We have these smaller communities of people doing life-on-life discipleship. They're learning together. They're starting to apply what they're learning. But that social space seems to be missing. What's that interplay?
Yeah. I think this is probably the most critical element. So again, like with the discipleship space, we like to kind of make a strong distinction between a small group and the discipleship core. Small group are often open. A discipleship core is not. Small group, tends to be around kind of learning in the head knowledge. And this is about learning formation in the way that we talked about. The small group doesn't tend to be that missional. And this is kind of like integrally tied to social space. So if discipleship doesn't help people, and it means like this kind of goes back to people will learn more by imitation as we immerse ourselves in mission than they will instruction. And so what we do is the discipleship core develops a rule and rhythm of life around kind of the three elements of the church, which is communion, community, and commission. And so community, what's a spiritual discipline that helps you connect and have a fervent love for God? Community for each other, and then commission is the mission. And so one of the simple practices that we would encourage everybody in the discipleship core to have is pray for 5 non-Christians daily and meet with one non-Christian once a week over a coffee, a dinner, lunch, or whatever. Now, if everybody in the discipleship core does that, now if they can't do that, that's what discipleship is about. Hey, are you dealing with a fear or whatever? Well, come over with me. You can do dinner with me a couple of times, learn how not only you don't have to be afraid of it, but it can be quite exciting and energizing. And when everybody has those practices, then you have some, you have some open spaces where you start to invite like your non-Christian friends to. And I think for me, like there's 3 things to think about. You can have a connecting space, which is just where your Christian friends and non-Christian friends connect. There's not any obvious kind of spirituality to it. There's not testimonies and so forth. It's just like friends meeting each other. I mean, it could be a game night, it could be a dinner, or it could be whatever. When we were at UCLA, we did these dollar dinners where we invited students to eat a homemade dinner for $1. And we pray at the beginning. That's as spiritual as it gets. There's people connecting and so forth. Then you have a sharing event, which is maybe a little bit more where someone does share something about maybe their own testimony or whatever. And then the third is challenging event, where that's kind of where you actually challenge people to look at where they're at with God. Now, I think like for a lot of our spaces, if we keep that social space on a week to week or every other week basis in the just the kind of connecting and sharing, that it's ideal to kind of build these bridges of like 6 weeks for those who seem ready to go through a more challenging aspect of things. And I think that oftentimes that group can become the next discipleship core starting the next social space.
That discipleship core is always on mission. They're always praying for as well, because they're praying for lost people. They're saying, yes, I'm going to meet with lost people. And then, as we're building that mission out, there's the pathway for the people there to multiply out into a new discipleship core. I like how that. Have you seen that play out in practice as you've been coaching and training some church planters? And can you give me an example or two of what that looks like?
I'll first kind of say this: like it takes a while for people to reorient to being church in this way, and so we encounter people at different places. Some that have kind of deconstructed what church meant to them, and they're starting to reconstruct. There's others that haven't started deconstructing yet. So it all depends on where they're at in that journey. It's going to take longer for people that need to, because what I found out is like somebody can, let's say we're kind of dialoguing, coaching, and someone can tell me the right things. That doesn't mean that they've owned it, and it doesn't mean that they're actually convicted about it. The only way I know they're convicted is that their practice changes. And so all I'm saying, in our experience of coaching, that we'll have, we encounter people a lot of ways, and our goal is just to kind of move them a few steps. And so if we meet somebody they hear it and they'll say, oh my gosh, this is like perfect. They're already oriented toward it. they become convinced of it. So there's a church in Honolulu, led by Un Strasser. She's a Korean physician. She's only planting like part-time. She's a physician full-time, well, as part-time too, about 2.5 days. She's a mother of 3, a wife.
Wow.
And they started their first year focused on the discipleship core and starting a social space. She said 90% of her time was devoted to that discipleship space and building together with them, building the social space. So at the end of 1 year, that's what they had. By year 2, a number of the people in her discipleship core were able to start. So they had three discipleship cores with 3 mid-sized groups. By year 3, what she said, now there's 9 of them.
Wow.
And so this is probably our high example.
Yeah.
And it becomes because there was a deep conviction in the leader that this particular way of doing church was important and good, and she could bring people on board with it, to be honest.
Yeah.
There's another one where we're working with a church that's primarily Korean. So they come from this very big church idea. They came to us with the goal of kind of learning more about discipleship. Now, they started their public gathering right when they entered our training, but they had 15, 20 people at it. It was kind of like a personal space in this huge public space, which felt awkward.
Yeah.
But they did that for the whole first year of the training. And there was 3 guys in the church that were part of the training. It really wasn't until the next year when we had the 3 wives do the training. they seemed to get it faster than the guys, or maybe they just needed the wives on board. But and with COVID hitting, they started to realize this public space hasn't been working, number one, even before COVID. Now with COVID, we can't really do it anyway. So they were forced to start with this discipleship core and they really worked on it, and they're working through what this pathway looks like for them.
Wow.
And now they've just started to do these social spaces. So they have 2 of these social spaces going on, but it took a long time. And so unlike Un, who's kind of ready to roll, and she kind of has an apostolic prophetic thing, we're kind of dealing with a pastor teacher gifting. Everything's slower, but they feel like they just become Christians because it's the first time they're meeting their neighbors, the first time they're praying for non-Christians. This is not a part of their whole Christian life.
Wow. Yeah.
And so they're slow, but I'm excited about their progress, and they're moving toward it with great excitement. And the stories that you hear is it's just it's just amazing. So,
that's awesome.
Is that success? Is that faithful? Yeah, I think there's something happening there. Yep. It's not as glamorous as the other story, but it's another story that's worth sharing.
Yeah, that's really great. I'd love to switch up, transition a little bit to your new book coming out, The Scandal of Leadership: Unmasking the Powers of Domination in the Church. It's a very tantalizing title. What are you going after in this book?
Yeah. So and I'll try to explain the title too. Obviously, we have a leadership crisis in the church in North America, and it's probably the case all over the world. And so what I'm trying to do, and I think a lot of it deals with a misuse of power in various ways. And so I'm trying to give a deeper diagnosis to the problem of domineering leadership in the church. And the way that I'm trying to go about it is I think that our misuse of power is all wrapped up in powers. And when I say the powers, I'm talking about Satan, demonic, and the principalities and powers. Yeah. I think we don't usually go there because we don't have a real good understanding of that. I think either people have a pre-modern view, or they may have a modern view, or whatever type of view they have of the powers. But I don't think our understanding of the powers shapes anything about the life that we lead in a general way. And so I really take quite a bit of time understanding the powers, and there is a fresh perspective that I want to give on each of these elements. And so and maybe the concrete way that they affect leaders. I define leadership as identity, praxis, like what we do in our methodology, and telos, where we're going and where we're taking the congregation.
Yeah.
And at each of those 3 points, the powers are at work to subvert our leadership. And so Stringfellow talks about the principalities and powers, which, by the way, I think is the only part of the powers that can be redeemed. I don't see redemption for the devil or the demonic. I think those are like actually, anyway, that's an important distinction. But the principalities and powers, which you see in Colossians, are redeemed. And so you have image. He talks about like there's every one of us has an image. There's 2 people or 2 entities that go by the same name. There's Joshua the person and Joshua the image. Or he uses the Marilyn Monroe. There's Monroe the person, Marilyn Monroe the image. The image seeks to possess us until we fully give ourselves over to the image instead of living into our image of God. And this is the weakest of the principalities, but nonetheless powerful. So, for example, if you listen to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, and you kind of look at the Mark Driscoll story, there came a point where it, to me, is very clear that he was possessed by his image instead of living in his image of God. He was the brand. He spent $200,000 to get his book on the bestseller list. This was an image that had fully grabbed him and possessed him. And then you have the church, or the institution could be the church, or it could be other things. You could take so you have institution and ideology are the other 2 elements. And by the way, the image kind of correlates. I correlate it to identity, institution to the praxis, and the telos to the ideology. And what's interesting is I see when I examine the temptations of Christ. By the way, like something that we don't give enough attention to before anybody goes on ministry. What are they doing? It's an encounter with the powers, right? And it's Jesus is baptized. The Father says, this is my Son in whom I'm well pleased, and the Spirit drives him into the desert or wilderness. And the first temptation is like, turn this rock into bread. Right before he says that, though, the devil says, if you are the Son of God. In other words, he was going right after his identity, because that is the core element of us. Like if we are not grounded in Christ, if our identity is not secure, and that's really the beginning of the Lord's Prayer, rooted identity, then we are basically at the devil's mercy. Like we will just we will be possessed by our image instead, because we will imitate our heroes. And if it's not Jesus, we will fall into all kinds of, disastrous places. So but the second, by way of Luke, was, I'll give you all these kingdoms. And this is kind of the, Jacques Ellul calls this the temptation of power. And it's kind of how we use our power. And I think if our identity is not secure, if our telos is messed up, our power is going to be messed up as well. The third temptation, Ellul calls it a religious temptation, because Jesus is on the top of the temple. And even at this point, a second time the devil says, if you are the Son of God, doesn't the scripture say, throw yourself from the temple, the angels will catch you? Now he's using the Bible to tempt Jesus. And so he calls this a religious temptation or an ideological religious temptation. And I basically, Stringfellow's and Rene Girard's understanding of ideology is like ideology. I think many of us are captive to ideology without knowing it. And when we're captive by ideology, it affects the way that we read scripture. So even like Paul, before he came to Christ, the way he read scripture caused him to, be accompaniment to the violence against the church itself. That was his understanding of scripture. And he could probably knew the scripture better than all of us, but he had an ideological reading of it. And so we don't realize that we were captive to ideology. But I think one of the ways that Girard says we know we're captive to ideology is when we create an enemy as a way of creating our own sense of belonging. or we demonize the other.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
and so if we build community by demonizing the other,
Mm.
I think we can know that we're off the path of Jesus.
Mm.
Jesus was willing to become the forgiving victim,
Yeah.
and he's calling us into that space as well.
Mm. It sounds fascinating. I was a couple weeks ago sitting around a table with a bunch of church leaders, and we were talking about power dynamics and power, and as men over women, white over coloreds,
Yeah.
whatever, all these different powers, and if we actually get some different power dynamic, one of the questions was how, if say somebody else in the church has more power than the other, how do we uh, not have the same sins of our past and go a different way? Because usually, a lot of times when as I read Miroslav Volf and others about what does it look like when people subjugate people, and then those oppressed people get power, they usually oppress others. And so in the midst of that dynamic, one of the things that I thought that was missing in our discussion was that the discussion of identity. And I think what you have said as that core, that image, that identity. And I think you're really on to something. I love what you did here, to be able to balance those powers. How can we balance those powers and not see the other as evil and subjugate people? And what does that look
Yeah.
like?
Yeah. So I think it requires probably more than we can do in a couple of minutes here. But like, I think so. One of the guys that I study and interact with is a guy named René Girard, who is a
Mm-hmm.
French cultural anthropologist, and he taught at Johns Hopkins, a bunch of different places, at Stanford. He got his first PhD in Paris. He's a French guy. Second PhD in the U.S., has 7 confirmed PhDs from 7 different countries,
Is
and
that all?
6 in Europe and 1 in Canada. I'm just trying to say he's a brainiac, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and he kind of converses with Freud and Nietzsche and Levi Strauss and all of these people, as opposed to different theologians. And he basically made 3 discoveries that I think are important for us to understand if
Yeah.
we're going to kind of, because like you said, that like whatever groups, if there is rivalry between groups, that's what I want us to understand. Because rivalry will kind of create doubles, and then we just mimic what the other group is doing. And
Yeah.
that's why over the centuries, one group gets power, another group's power, and everybody acts the same way.
Yeah.
Because we're imitating what the other group did.
Yeah.
So and this is kind of his first discovery was this, and it was from reading like what separates out like Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, Proust, and these great authors, what he called novelists, from what he called the romantic. His first book, and the French title was The Romantic Lie and the Novelistic Truth. The romantic lie was that our desires, we create our own desires. So whatever the object of our desire is, we desire it and will it to being. What all of the great authors did, and this is what he learned from them, because what makes a great author, whatever they're writing feels real to life. Like we can see ourselves in it, right?
Yeah.
A good movie, a good book. All of the great writers eventually in their writing came to a place where desire was not like this straight line, but it was a triangle, meaning that our desires are gained through our models. Whoever we look up to, we imitate their desires. So here's the thing. So if we imitate their desire, let's kind of put this I'd bring this into the church context. Let's say you're a lead pastor, or let's say someone's a lead pastor. Not just that they're the lead pastor, but they desire to be the lead pastor.
Yeah.
Now, if anybody looks up to them, they will desire to be the lead pastor. Well, what happens here is that the leader becomes an obstacle to the disciple getting what they desire, the very desire that they gave them. This is a scandal. The word scandalon that Jesus uses is an obstacle. Same word. The scandal of leadership that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the scandal of leadership, is that when we have unhealthy desires and our disciples imitate that desire, it will bring us into unconsciously, subconsciously in rivalry with the leader. And so now this rivalry, and if there's multiple scandals, in other words, multiple disciples getting that same desire, what that creates is a mimetic crisis. And in a mimetic crisis, what happens is everybody goes against everybody. Now, in ancient days, before there was even any judicial branch or law, really, primitive people, what happened at this point is the second discovery that Girard came with, and that is the scapegoat mechanism. And this is a mechanism that kind of kicks in. It's fairly random, and mimetically, the whole community lands on a scapegoat. Yeah. And in the beginning, they killed that person. And while it's all kind of random, the scapegoat tended to have common characteristics. They were either very weak or deformed, or they were a minority, these types of things. Because or it could be the king, it could be the leader. The commonality between those at the bottom and those at the top is they both have one step in the community, and they also are differentiated enough that they have a foot outside of the community. So by killing them, it doesn't kind of create revenge, but rather it creates a peace among the community until the process kind of repeats itself all over again. And so the scapegoat mechanism is the second thing that happens. And so you'll see this, even though we have the intelligence of the scapegoat now, we know kind of this happens. But the third discovery that he came up with, and this is what actually made this kind of Frenchman, who's this deep philosopher, who, by the way, brought whole postmodernism to America because he hosted a conference at Johns Hopkins with Derrida and all of the postmodern thinkers, because he was in that level of thinking. He, in his third book, kind of came out as a Christian, even though he became a Christian right in his first book, as he was kind of studying this thing and realized he was a victim of this kind of mimetic desire. But the third thing that he discovered was that Jesus became the willing scapegoat, right? First, the Jews and the Romans scapegoated him. And by the way, before Jesus, for the way the scapegoating worked is everybody had to consider you guilty. There was no innocence in the scapegoat. The scapegoat, everybody considered guilty. And this is why even the disciples could not identify with Jesus anymore, because they got caught in the mimetic contagion of the crowd. And so even Peter denied him to a 13-year-old girl. Think about what that meant in that time. So Jesus willingly becomes a scapegoat in order to reveal the scapegoat mechanism that's happened since the very beginning, since Cain and Abel. That's really where we see it first happen. And so he's revealing, and that's also kind of the breaking loose of the powers that are at work. And so a lot of what I'm saying is like we probably are always mimicking the power structures that we have seen, and we haven't broken out of them. And the only way that Girard says that we can overcome the powers is to imitate Jesus. Now, when I say that, like, that sounds like nice and easy kind of idea here. But and here's the thing, like Jesus, the only way that he could overcome the powers and the temptations was to imitate the Father. And that's why, I can only do what I see the Father doing. I can only say what the Father's like. He was imitating the Father. And when we imitate Christ, we will also kind of, have a connection to the Father in the same way. I think this is where it comes to Philippians 2 and understanding better the kenotic journey that he went on, and obedience and humility, and ultimately becoming this forgiving victim that we have to learn. And we learn it from a guy who's in jail, who's facing death. And he's trying to say this. He first lifts Jesus as a model, then he lifts up Timothy, then he lifts up Epaphroditus, and then he lifts up himself as a different way of doing leadership, a different way of belonging, and a different way of being. And it comes down to all of us get our sense of identity from the group that we belong to, or that we feel we belong to the most. And our belonging is connected to our rationality. we actually see things, that's why we, our whatever is true to us or fake news to us is ultimately about the group that we primarily belong to.
Yeah.
So our belonging affects our rationality. And what I think Paul is challenging us to, like, do you really belong to Christ?
Yeah.
And what we have in Philippians is there's two leaders that have entered into mimetic rivalry. And the way that Paul is trying to resolve that is through first look at Jesus, have this mind that was in Christ, look at some other good examples, and then look at my example and follow me. Because the only way out of that is through imitation of good models instead of bad models.
Wow. That's fascinating. And I'm excited to dive deeper into that and continue to walk people through these ideas. And I think if we could start to get a different perspective and different models and imitate Christ, I think we could actually see a different result than we've been seeing that there. And so I'm excited for this new book. When's it? When
Probably October. I think it's October is
October.
The current.
Come on, Cher, you're getting me excited.
I'm in the middle of finishing the final chapter, and then I have to edit a few more chapters, and then have this process.
That's good. I'm really excited. Well, there's go ahead.
Let me say, so the scandal of leadership, the first scandal is that when we become a scandal to those who we're discipling, but the opposite way is following the scandalous way of Christ. And it is a scandal in the current world that we live in.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. A couple questions here at the end. One, I'd like to ask, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
I would say read, widely, read things that are different than what you believe, kind of expand your thinking, your critical thinking, and just, I think I was very passionate for Christ at that time. So, I would say that's probably been one of the more important things for me,
Yeah, that's good. So, with that, anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Well, most of my reading has kind of been in the realm of my current book. So my three primary people that I connect with is Walter Wink and his trilogy on the powers. Rene Girard has about 20 books, and William Stringfellow has about 16 books. So I kind of like to go deep with people that I feel like are deep themselves.
Yeah.
So I've enjoyed Sarah Coakley and some of her kind of systematic theology. And one of the examples I'm going to use as a kind of modern example to follow that I feel like understands kinetic spirituality and leadership is Oscar Romero, who ultimately in his quest to follow Christ was shot as he was giving mass. And his story in El Salvador is quite interesting.
That's good. Yeah. Where can people find you? Anything that you want to tell people about?
Yeah, like I'm not as socially geared right now because I'm in my writing cave, but like I do tweet sometimes at Dream Awakener, and I don't really blog much anymore, but I do have my old blogs on jrwoodward.com, and at V3 movement. Sometimes I'll do an article here and there. But yeah, right now I'm not as social media engaged, but I probably will start once I get out of my writing cave.
Yeah, that's good. Well, JR, it was just a pleasure to talk to you, and it was fascinating for me just to talk through these 4 spaces of belonging and how we could actually start to multiply church and to be on mission together, and then really talk about the powers and how we could start to imitate Christ in the midst of things and get better models. So thank you very much. It was just it was a pleasure. It was great.
Thanks. Good to see you, man.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.